Hello, everybody. This is Ben Hansen from MinnMax, and I'm here with
Kyle Hilliard.
Kyle. Who is your favorite film director?
Ooh, that's a big question, but for the sake of this video, I'll say Mr. Hayao Miyazaki.
Okay, fantastic. I'm sure you've heard of his films, Spirited Away,
My Neighbor Totoro,
Howl's Moving Castle.
best movie of all time, Princess Mononoke.
Interesting. And recently, I came across this YouTube video, which all good info comes from. This is a guy named Ree Snow. I'll put the link in the description there. But he translated this old interview from Miyazaki from Studio Ghibli, and it was a magazine interview in Family Computer Magazine in 1992, which is a magazine that's no longer around. So it's an interview between Miyazaki, and not our Lord and Savior from Software's Miyazaki, and Shigeru Miyamoto.
Yeah.
In 1992.
Early SNES era, right?
It's like the same year that, Mario Kart came out, Super Mario Land 2.
And then Porco Rosso had just come out or was getting ready to come out at the time of this interview.
That is, I think, the PR campaign for them to actually make this interview happen. Yeah. But also in terms of like the weird connections between Miyazaki and Miyamoto, I completely forgot about this, but Kotabe, who did a lot of the old Mario art and Nintendo art in general, that he was at Toei Animation and he was actually in the same classes as Miyazaki.
Really?
Yeah,
I had no
they were in the
idea.
same classes for like a keyframe study and stuff like that. But what's fascinating in this is buried in the middle of this interview, Miyazaki describes the one game that he's been tempted to create to Shigeru Miyamoto. He says, "Someone once told me that you can do a lot of things in video games. I didn't know much about video games, but I nonchalantly talked about a game that I wanted to create. It's a story about Japanese troops during World War II. It takes place when the Japanese forces were nearly wiped out by the U.S. in the South Pacific Ocean. The objective of this game is to board a 3-seater torpedo bomber and hit a U.S. aircraft carrier with a torpedo. That said, you can also choose not to get on a bomber." This is where the concept of the game goes off the rails for me, where it's like, okay, I got it. And like that.
It starts off, it's like, oh, this is like a cool pilot. You love airplanes, Miyazaki. This is a flight game. I get it. And then it's like, okay, wait, hold on.
Well, you could also see it as like an old game, even like arcade game from the 70s style of thing, where it's just like this mechanical thing where it's like, okay, you're trying to drop a torpedo from an airplane onto a U.S. aircraft carrier. We'll get into that later.
He's basically pitching World of Warplanes in 1992.
But then this is the human twist, right? So he says, you can also choose not to get on a bomber. Then what will you do? Maybe you grow vegetables on an island to sustain yourself. Maybe you starve and eventually the war ends. Or maybe you become a prisoner of war and stay in a prison camp until the war is over. Or maybe you die during the process.
And I believe Miyamoto goes,
He does a lot of, I see.
yes, this is impossible.
Right. So there are many choices you can make. You can also, let's keep throwing them on there. You can also test your torpedo before attacking the ship and check if the cock can be removed properly. If you don't test the torpedo, you fail to drop the torpedo or something like that. Or maybe an enemy aircraft flies over, so what now? You want to fly over the cloud or fly under the cloud? Since you're on a 3-seater bomber, the person in the rear seat is the gunner. Now we know that Miyazaki is a specific man. He wants things a very specific way for his films. This is the part that blows my mind. You have 47 bullets at the start of the game and already used 30 bullets. You want to reload it now or do it later? Okay, stop. Okay, so this is... we gotta stop. Can't go on. Okay, so this chunk here.
It's just, I don't know, this crazy open-ended, choice-driven, not narrative focused, but like very specific decisions. Like every decision is big, whether you shoot your gun, where you fly. Like, when you're playing an action game, it's all very fast and you're kind of moving around. But what I think Miyazaki is describing is something where every move that you make should be considered and thought about fully before you make an action.
And I'm seeing it a little bit as a sim, like it could work in that way at this point, right? But then this is the part which twists everything, where he says, we would make these animated scenes and you need to choose your action before 5 or 10 light indicators turn on. It's based on a timer. I discussed about making such game. I have no idea how many laser discs we need to create a game like that. But anyway, even if someone had
laser discs.
Even if someone had said, okay, let's make this game, I don't think we could have done it. The animators would get fed up because they need to redraw similar sequences again and again. I can imagine them quitting one by one. So this is the part where it's like, okay, so he's imagining animated sequences, because obviously you need that Ghibli talent directly going into this game from 1992. I don't know if he's even familiar with the game Dragon's Lair, right?
Yeah, but that's what I thought about. Yeah.
Right. But then so combining Dragon's Lair style animation from Studio Ghibli with more of a systemic, almost an immersive sim style game is the part that breaks my brain.
I think of like, okay, if you don't join the war, you go play Stardew Valley.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's how Miyazaki saw it. I think he saw it as like you make a decision and then you see an animated sequence of someone farming.
Oh, I did not think of it that way.
More almost like borderline FMV, like Dragon's Lair. Maybe?
Right.
I don't know. Like you introduced me to this interview. I was not aware of it. It blows my mind that Miyazaki would ever even think about a video game in terms of like, what if I were to create something? Like he just seems so dismissive of the medium and like uninterested in it that like it blew my mind to hear him talking to Miyamoto and kind of be like, hey, I have like an idea for a video game. I was like, really?
What do you think, big guy? Think you can make this for me, Nintendo? No, he doesn't actually ask them to make it. But so he's not a big fan of video games. Elsewhere in this interview, he says, quote, I'm not a big fan of video games.
Oh, there you go.
But sometimes I'd watch my son play from behind. I tend to cheer for a bad guy that my son is fighting. Can you imagine poor Goro trying to play Castlevania or something?
We should dive into that. If you're not familiar, it's been publicized that Miyazaki's relationship with his son is somewhat difficult and strained. And Goro directed a film, Tales from Earthsea was his first movie, and Miyazaki was quoted as saying, it feels like I was sitting in there for about 3 hours. The idea that he is standing behind his son and just being like, hey, I hope Bowser kills you. So I was like, oh, okay. There's a lot going on here.
Well, I don't get why you named him after the Mortal Kombat character.
That was strange. So,
but I love that he says like, I'm just rooting for the bad guy, and then Miyamoto says, that's a correct way to enjoy video games. Which I
appreciate that. Of like, I like Miyamoto's approach of like, yeah, you can. That's the thing that's interesting about my medium is like you can sort of do it however you want.
Right. Right. So the idea that he says, like raising crops and just surviving on the island. Like, it's amazing that this is also 4 years before Harvest Moon came out. And I'm sure there's other games in the NES era.
Like before the original? The first Harvest? Oh,
right.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
It's 96. It's a late one. It seems like what he's trying to get to is not make this war epic, obviously, but in a very Miyazaki way. Let's zoom in. Let's focus on the human struggle. Mm-hmm. If you are just a Japanese soldier on your last legs during World War II on a Pacific island, like, what are your choices? And this is probably just a little role-playing thing, because he says he likes to run these simulations in his head, right?
Yeah.
So this is probably just a little role-playing scenario that he's ran through his mind, and he thought, well, if video games you can choose your action, this is the thing. And it's probably not more thought out than that.
Yeah, I think there was one point where I think there's a fundamental difference between video games and dramas. If it's a drama, characters don't necessarily choose a correct path. They often try to do something impossible to succeed, even if they know there's no chance. But then something happens and they make it somehow. In a way, making a drama is how to make up a good, convincing lie. Which, by the way, I think that's really interesting. And honestly, one of the reasons, this is like a personal aside, like choice-driven games aren't as compelling to me as sort of just straight narrative games. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that that's how he approaches filmmaking and telling stories, but then his video game idea was very much driven by sort of the choice of the user.
Right. Know? At least he acknowledges the possibilities of video games, and he has a lot, lines about, it's probably not possible. And Miyamoto's like, well, like with CD-ROMs in the future, Miyamoto plugs Seventh Guest more than
multiple times.
Like, you gotta check out Seventh Guest.
Yeah,
that's the way to go. So I believe people who like video games are not good at making movies. In a way, movies are more diverse than video games. I'm sure Miyamoto's like, hey, come on. You should check out my Pikmin shorts in 20 years. They're going to blow your mind.
Well, yeah, and Miyamoto does defend games shortly after that, saying the technology is not there yet. Let me tell you about Seventh Guest again.
But saying like eventually once it gets more cinematic that we can eventually reach these levels that you're going for. But let's talk about technology with this game. Like, let's just imagine that he's not going to make it a PC game. Let's say that, the businessmen at the studio are like, okay, you got to release it on the Super Nintendo. What would this game have looked like?
Yeah, I don't...
1942 combined with Harvest Moon?
Yeah, with like really like not cutscenes, but like really pretty sort of drawings, with the 16-bit engine with like text underneath. Then the question is like, would it have been like isometric view overhead of a plane, or would it have been like first person with like that faux 3D?
Oh, no way. No way.
Like
that seems like way too much. But I wonder if there's something about like creating a game for the Super Nintendo where it almost would have allowed more wiggle room, where it would be so far from Miyazaki's personal uncanny valley, which I know is the wrong term to use here.
I see what you're saying.
Knowing that like, well, this is nowhere near any of my films, so I will give it more of a pass compared to if they tried to make this on the PS3 generation, like a Ni no Kuni. I'm sure he has so many specific complaints about the look of Ni no Kuni, which Ghibli was involved with, but Miyazaki wasn't directly, obviously. But I don't think he would look at a Super Nintendo game and say that it's an insult to life itself. But thinking about where Miyazaki is at this point in his life, so Porco Rosso, in the documentary, he refers to that film as foolish.
I think he once described it as being too personal.
That's set during World War I, so he's starting to toy with like real world
And Wind
stories.
Rises is also World War I as well.
No, that's
right?
World War II.
That's World War II. Okay.
Well, I mean, it's in between, but it's the run up to World War II,
yeah,
essentially. But yeah, it's interesting thinking about that in 1982. But then also in 1988, Takahata, also one of the prominent Ghibli directors, he released Grave of the Fireflies, which is a World War II, more dramatic film. But obviously, he's said himself, like he was born in 1941. He's been obsessed with World War II his entire life.
Yeah.
His father made airplane parts, so he's always had this war mindset, just trying to understand what exactly happened there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that eventually gets expressed in The Wind Rises. It's weird to read this pitch for a game and think like, oh, I bet he got some of this. It's not starring a soldier, obviously, but just dealing with just the personal drama during World War II for Japanese individuals.
The decisions that must be made
Right.
around wartime. you know?
But it's weird to think about film directors and their approach to games. Like one time I heard when Spielberg was working on LMNO, which is that first-person game where it's all like escorting an alien, basically Eco with an alien instead of Yorda. Yeah. The problem with Spielberg with all of those game design meetings is with all those meetings he would speak up and pitch gags. Where you'd be like, oh yeah, then maybe like the character could like crawl into a bunch of tires and an explosion could go off and the tires roll down the hill and it's like this good physical thing. It's like, yeah, one-off gags aren't good for video games. They're very expensive for video games. You need to make something that you can really sit in, which is interesting thinking of Miyazaki then, because I feel like his worlds, they're less gag-oriented than Spielberg's films, obviously. So it's like, just in terms of creating a world in a video game that you could just soak in, that seems like a good opportunity. And maybe that itch was scratched for some people by Ni no Kuni 1, but I do think that there was potential here, and now at this point in Miyazaki's life, there's no way he would ever go back to directly make a video game.
No, and certainly not.
How do you think the game would have been received? Do you think it would have been released to the West?
This is the world where, like, in 94, this game came out in Japan.
Sure.
I don't think it would have come west. No.
Yeah.
I think it took so long for Ghibli to sort of make an impact in the West to begin with. And
what about just like content-wise? Do you think that would be too much to bring it to the West? Just because, according to him, the goal is to bomb this U.S. aircraft carrier.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think the main selling point of that game, if you imagine that it released in Japan, would be like, this is a Miyazaki video game. I think they would struggle to figure out how to pitch that game, because it would be ahead of its time in terms of like looking at war outside of just like shooting bad guys. You know what I mean? Which is like a game idea that like like in the last decade, we've sort of finally started seeing that like, oh, there's a lot more to war than just like trying to get headshots on the battlefield,
That's when video gamers learn that.
That's right. Yeah, we finally figured it out.
Oh, I get it. But if it would have been released in the West, I think just the concept of like, wait, what? You're like, the goal is to attack American soldiers?
They would have just tried to swap it around probably, right? Just like
that would be so stupid.
But I mean, at that time, like that's probably like the simple action. It's like, oh, we'll just change the flags on the planes. It'll be fine.
Oh my god!
Or just make them fictional or something.
Yeah. Never know.
Yeah, no, that game never would have come out of America.
But it's super fun. I'm glad that we found this little nugget to know that this is the one game that Miyazaki would have been interested in making. And there's only one solution here, Kyle. Please,
Kickstarter?
Somebody make it in Dreams.
Oh, Dreams, of course.
Dreams, our second favorite game of 2019 here at MinnMax. Please, somebody make Miyazaki's game in Dreams. What if in 2020, when he releases his next film, How Do You Live, what if it is just exactly the scenario? And he's like, you know what? I went back, I read that article. I think I'm going to pull that for my next film.
He found that magazine that doesn't exist anymore, pulled it off his shelf. I'm sure he's a guy that really goes back and reads his old interviews.
Oh, got him again, Miyazaki. What a zinger.
This was really smart what I said back then.
Also, we should plug that what really got me in the mood to look at this and learn all about it was Blank Check, their podcast where they've been running through Miyazaki not too long ago, and those are really great episodes if you want to deep dive into Miyazaki.
We should just plug Blank Check every episode.
It's a very, very good podcast. That's it. If you're not familiar with us, MinnMax is a Patreon about games, friends, and getting better. We have game club discussions that we call the Deepest Dive, where we talk about games very in depth. We have the MinnMax Show podcast airing every single Thursday. We have streams every Tuesday and a bunch of other fun bonus stuff. So check out the Patreon or check out our YouTube channel to learn more. Thanks, everybody. From in-depth game club discussions with the community to live streams every single week, weekly podcasts, exclusive videos, everything under the sun is at patreon.com/MinnMax2Ns. Check it out, everybody.